Welcome back to Proxy, everybody, and today we are going to be once again looking at the avatar of Khaine, and guys, it's still bringing the pain. The avatar is undoubtedly one of the best units in our index. However, since the last balanced data slate, opponents have gotten a lot of tools to be able to deal with the avatar of Khaine. And as we're starting to see more and more, the avatar of Khaine can't exactly stand up to a lot of the things that he was able to stand up to in the beginning of the edition. With the nerf of fate dice, the change in how modifiers work, and of course the layers of buffs that other armies have gotten since the beginning of the edition, the avatar of Khaine is no longer the unkillable juggernaut that it was at the beginning of the edition. However, it is still extremely powerful, and like I said, one of the best units in the index. However, your success with the avatar of Khaine is dependent on a number of factors, which I will hope to address in today's video, because although the avatar of Khaine is still a very mighty monster and a very difficult opponent to deal with, if used incorrectly, your avatar of Khaine can quickly become a pile of rubble, and your army will soon follow, because of course the avatar of Khaine is quite the investment. So before we dive right in, I do want to go ahead and just list out the points that we're going to be discussing in today's video. We're going to be talking about the stats, weapons, and special rules of the avatar of Khaine, a quick refresher for you guys. Then we're going to be talking about the avatar's strengths and weaknesses, his combos and synergies, mistakes to avoid when using the avatar of Khaine in your army, positioning the avatar of Khaine effectively, and I will give you guys a bit of a look via diagrams, as well as an explanation as to why positioning is so important for the avatar's success. Lastly, the role the avatar of Khaine plays in an Eldar army and how to make the most out of it. So taking a look at the avatar's stat line, it is a pretty beefy stat line. It does have decent movement for a large monster without fly at 10 inches. It also gets some abilities that helps it move a little bit faster, which we will talk about in a second. It is also very durable at toughness 12 with a 2+ save and a 4+ invulnerable, making it really hard for anti-large weaponry like las cannons to be able to penetrate through its thick molten hide. And lastly, it does have decent OC at 5, but don't let this fool you, even your basic squad of intercessors can out-control him on objectives. As far as the ranged weapons that the avatar of Khaine is carrying, he has the Wailing Doom, which is a massive strength 16, AP -4, D6 + 2 damage weapon. It also has sustained hits D3, which means that with the use of fate dice, you're getting an automatic D3 extra attacks with an insane strength, AP, and damage. However, keep in mind that it only has range 12, and again, it typically needs fate dice to operate at full capacity. However, this does mean that this thing has a very powerful overwatch. Now, a good opponent will stay out of the avatar's 12-inch bubble of its range if possible, and it won't stop everything. It won't stop things like a monolith from being able to, disembark its, immortal legion, but it will put a serious dent in anything trying to harm it. As far as its melee weapons go, it's a pretty big melee powerhouse with two profiles. It has a strike profile, which is the same as the range attack, except instead of strength 16, it's strength 14, and has 6 attacks, which is massive. The sweep has 12 attacks at strength 7, AP -2, and damage 2, which is good versus lighter infantry. Typically, anything of a marine or bigger, you want to use the strike, and anything lighter than that, you want to use the sweep. As far as its abilities go, it has the Molten Form, which halves all damage, making him immensely durable. And this is probably the main reason people use him to essentially capture primary objectives, because of that immense durability. However, there are things in the game now, through different rules changes and updates and things like that, that can get around this. Especially weapons that ignore modifiers, which this counts as. So do beware, there are characters in the game which ignore modifiers, which will essentially one-round the avatar of Khaine. It also has the Bloody Handed aura, which gives friendly units within 6, 1 to their advance rolls and 1 to their charge rolls, which, by the way, works on the avatar of Khaine himself, because it just says a friendly Aeldari unit within 6 inches of this model, and he is counted as within his own aura. So therefore, he's getting +1 to his advances and +1 to his charges. This also works really well on things like Wraith Blades and Storm Guardians, units that want to get to primary objectives as early as possible in the first and second turns of the game. However, unfortunately, he does also have a damage profile, which means he's at -1 to hit while at 5 wounds and below. The Avatar of Khaine is one of those units that will actually probably suffer from this quite a bit because he is durable and your opponents are going to be shooting him and charging him in close combat trying to kill him. The good news is because he's basically weapon skill, ballistic skill 2, he's only going to be hitting on a 3+ after this, but even so, it can affect his damage a little bit. And, unless you have a guide nearby, it's going to be pretty hard to sometimes get around bad rolls. As far as his points cost, he does cost 335, which in my honest opinion is a great cost for what you get. I was actually expecting him to become more expensive in the last balance data slate, but they decided to nerf the Yinkarn instead, and hallelujah, thank goodness they didn't touch the Avatar of Khaine. He's still 335 and absolutely awesome. The only thing I think that did affect him in the last balanced data slate was, of course, the Fate Dice nerf, which we all know was, kind of targeted towards these bigger models that are able to utilize Fate Dice more effectively. And the more I think about it, the more I realize that the Fate Dice nerf was probably due to models like the Avatar of Khaine, the Yinkarn, Warwalkers, and other more high-value targets that benefited a lot from Fate Dice. So in a way, it was a more blanket nerf to the models in our army that could make great use of Fate Dice. As far as his keywords go, he is a monster, character, and demon, which means he is vulnerable to several anti-effects. Anti-demon effects, anti-character effects, and of course anti-monster effects are all going to be extra effective against the Avatar. As far as his strengths and weaknesses go, the Avatar of Khaine has massive melee power and a fantastic range attack. I would even say one of the best anti-large range attacks in the entire game when coupled with Fate Dice. And to put it in perspective for you, the Avatar of Khaine on average does about as much as 1.5 fire prisms against a large target that walks into its Overwatch range. It's also extremely tough, having damage with toughness 12, and as well as a 2+ save and a 4+ invulnerable, which is going to be able to shrug off most high-powered anti-large attacks. Things like last cannons, if this guy is under the effects of fortune, are going to be wounding on 5s, so you're going to need, on average, about 3 last cannons to be able to wound this thing. And of course, that's not accounting for things like lightning fast reflexes and other buffs that you can put on the Avatar of Khaine as well. As far as his weaknesses go, he does have a very low OC. It's only 5, which means objectives can be taken fairly easily. And he does have a big base, but it's not as big as something like a Wraith Knight. It's not as big as a Wave Serpent's hull, so it can't easily block enemies from getting on the objective in the first place. And I've actually had a number of games where I've had an opponent charge in with infantry that could possibly win against the Avatar, just hoping that at least a couple of models in the unit could survive. Because if even 3 tactical Space Marines survives combat against the Avatar of Khaine, they're going to be controlling that objective. He's also extremely weak to certain anti-effects, mortal wounds, and attacks that ignore modifiers. Trajan Valoris comes to mind, being able to not only ignore pretty much every modifier, but also being able to double his attacks, and also get lethal hits because of the Martial Kata. And of course, with a damage 3 weapon with -2 AP, Valoris could very easily one-round an Avatar of Khaine in close combat. As far as the Avatar's combos and synergies are concerned, Fortune massively increases the Avatar's durability, and I think this is easily the best synergy that the Avatar of Khaine has. If you are taking an Avatar of Khaine, you should be taking a Farseer on foot, no questions asked. It just makes him so much more durable, and the Avatar is already going to be a pretty big target on the battlefield. Overwatch, lightning fast reactions, and fire and fade are also all great stratagems to use on the Avatar as well. Overwatch is the obvious one because of the sustained hits D3 that his powerful weapon has. But also lightning fast reactions because the Avatar is the incarnate of Khaine himself, and unlike Wraith units, can actually be targeted by this stratagem. Fire and Fade, while initially doesn't seem like a stratagem that you would utilize on the Avatar of Khaine that much, is extremely useful as well, and can really put you in a dominating position if your opponent doesn't expect it. Moving 10 inches, advancing 7 inches because of course his own aura, and then being able to move another 10 can get you from one side of the board to another and out of line of sight of your opponent's main guns. And trust me, there is nothing scarier than having an Avatar of Khaine turn 1 in your opponent's deployment zone, or at the very least, close to it. Alright, so the Avatar of Khaine obviously is very powerful, but there are mistakes players use when fielding the Avatar of Khaine, even in competitive play. It can be a very hard model to actually utilize properly. And unlike the models of other factions like Catan Shards, the Avatar of Khaine is not only more expensive, but also a little bit less durable. So you do need to account for that when using the Avatar of Khaine. It's tough, but it's not invincibly tough. So don't expose him early for no reason. Allowing your opponent free damage is never a good idea. You put him out in the open, yes, he might survive turn 1 on the objective, but there's really no point for him being out there other than to maybe overwatch bait your opponent. And if your opponent gets a free round of shooting at the Avatar for no retaliation in return, that might actually not be the greatest of ideas, especially if you're not scoring primaries on the next turn. The Avatar is also very powerful, but isn't a one-man army anymore like he used to be in the beginning of the edition, where you could spend fate dice however you wanted, whenever you wanted. And there's a lot of stuff out there that will simply kill him in a single turn, either of shooting or combat. I've seen it several times in competitive play, and I've experienced it myself. And you also have to consider that a lot of armies, through the balanced data slates, have gotten so much cheaper. Armies like Tau are just spamming Hammerheads, Skyrays, Riptides, and of course you also have Dark Eldar, which have a ton of Dark Lances in their lists that are able to reroll all their hits. And you also have things like Incubi, who can reroll all their hits and wounds on charge and get +1 to wound on top of that, forcing the Avatar of Khaine to its invulnerable save. And yes, the Avatar of Khaine is tough, but 8 Dark Lances to the face, followed up with a bunch of Incubi charging in, is probably going to be able to kill the Avatar of Khaine fairly quickly. Especially if you don't have the 2 CP that the Dark Eldar player will obviously use from the Archon's ability to increase the command point cost of lightning fast reactions. So for the Avatar to be effective, he needs support. So make sure you have units that can respond to emerging threats. If your opponent spends 600 points shooting and assaulting the Avatar to destroy him, make sure that you have enough units that are in position to, quickly respond to be able to wipe that enemy off the board. And again, if you're playing against Dark Eldar and they spend something like 600 points shooting at you, then assaulting you, make sure that you're in a decent position so you can retaliate accordingly. And while that can be pretty tough against units like Scourges, who can simply fly back behind obscuring terrain, remember that we also have access to very cheap indirect fire options like Dark Reapers. And guys, Dark Reapers are actually pretty good, especially in the emerging meta. We're having several, different armies that are emerging. Things like Tau are very effective right now. Imperial Guard is looking a lot better than it was. And then, of course, you also have Dark Eldar and armies like Sisters of Battle. And Dark Reapers happen to be pretty good against all those different types of armies that are currently emerging in the meta. But of course, there are so many other things you could do, right? You could respond with really fast units like jet bikes. Just make sure you have units in position to counter your opponent if your opponent brings in a coordinated strike to kill your Avatar. All right, so here's the thing though. If you don't know how to position your Avatar effectively, it's not going to be able to be very effective. And the main reason for this is the Avatar is a single entity, right? And even though it's fairly fast, it can be easily caught on the wrong side of the board if you're not careful, and either left out of the battle completely or simply killed if you overextend it. So what I'm going to go through with you guys is a couple of different ways in which you can both make sure that your Avatar is effective on the battlefield and is performing his role to the utmost, and also at the same time keep him safe so he doesn't die in the very first turn. So for today's example, we're going to use Terrain Layout 1, a very popular terrain layout for competitive play. But if you guys want me to use WTC terrain setups or anything like that, shoot me an email and, include the PDF of the terrain layout you want me to use in my next video, and I would be happy to do that for you. So looking at our first setup here, this is something I like to use often because normally as an Eldar player, you're going to have to resign yourself to the fact that you might not be able to take the center objective. Anything taking the center objective is not only going to be able to be easily surrounded, but makes itself a huge target for the enemy army. And because Eldar units are usually, on the less durable side, that's typically not a very good idea for our faction. However, due to our immense speed, we are much more effective at taking the flanks, surrounding your opponent, and of course outmaneuvering them. But typically speaking, if you don't have something tough that can hold down the flank, you're going to struggle to actually be able to effectively control the board edges. And of course, in comes the Avatar of Khaine. So you basically deploy the Avatar on the flank, usually on the opponent's weak side. And by the way, just a little bit of advice for you guys. When you are deploying the Avatar of Khaine, when you're setting it up during deployment, and you guys are alternating when you're deploying your units, trust me, save the Avatar of Khaine for last, because it will give you a really good idea of what your opponent has and how quickly your opponent can respond to your Avatar's movements. So in this example, we deploy the Avatar on the weak side. Now that means the side with less opponents on it. This is going to be important because we want our Avatar to affect the battle as much as possible and not be killed off early. And we want to give, our opponent some hard choices to make in regards to what they need to do and what they need to kill. So we're going to simply deploy our Avatar on the left side of the board. He's that big red dot you see there. And we're going to march him up 10 inches in the movement phase, but we're also going to advance him. There's no reason not to. He's probably not going to have a target anyway with his Wailing Doom, so we're going to just advance him forward. Now, the cool thing about this is that the Avatar of Khaine is getting +1 to his advance rolls. So by the simple use of a stratagem for a command point or a fate dice, we can actually move him a total of 17 inches in the movement phase alone. This means even with terrain in his way, we can very easily move the Avatar onto the objective on the left-hand side, just barely towing it, or we can move the Avatar straight towards your opponent's deployment zone and out of line of sight. As you can see, majority of your opponent's army is just not going to be able to see the Avatar from range if we decide to move him straight forward. Now, what if you decide to move him onto the objective? Now, this is going to be based on what your opponent has that can actually take the Avatar of Khaine out. If you notice that there's not a lot of enemy units in a position to attack and kill the Avatar, and you think that with the combination of fate dice and of course all his durability buffs, that he can survive a couple of last cannons or, a couple of multi-meltas or whatever it is, then it's typically a good idea because your opponent is going to be forced to deal with the Avatar of Khaine now. The Avatar of Khaine is on an objective. It's going to score you points. You may draw secondary objectives which require your opponent to take it, like Tempting Target. And that is going to dictate the decisions your opponent makes, and they may actually, right here and now, make mistakes that are going to cost them the game at the end. Like, for example, maneuvering a unit or a big vehicle around that center ruin in their deployment zone because now they have to deal with the Avatar of Khaine. However, if you notice that there's significant amounts of threats on the left-hand side of the board that can easily kill the Avatar in one round. Maybe they have Trajan Valoris, like I spoke about earlier, or, Grimaldus with a bunch of Primaris Sword Brethren. Just, some crazy stuff that can get into combat with the Avatar and kill him outright. Then maybe you shouldn't go for that. Maybe you should actually just shoot up the board on the left side, get into your opponent's deployment zone if possible, and create a nuisance for them there. The Avatar of Khaine can also, at this point, score some secondary objectives. Because, of course, if you get something like deploy teleport homers, you can score some easy points with the Avatar. However, of course, there may be some better opportunities for you or, units that are going to be able to move faster. So do keep that in mind as well. It's not always a great idea to shoot your Avatar of Khaine straight into the enemy deployment zone. Only do so if you are not going to be retaliated against and you can safely position your Avatar there. Now, of course, if you can't do either of these and you still find yourself in this position, you can always move your Avatar more conservatively, maybe just out of line of sight, but then can come out and respond later to an enemy walking onto the objective and trying to take it from you. This way, the Avatar can still deal significant damage, and yeah, he's not holding a primary objective, but it's still something your opponent has to deal with, and now the Avatar is in a better position. Okay, so in this next deployment, I'm going to show you how to safely but effectively use the Avatar to take control of the center objective from the beginning of the game. Now, you're not always going to want to do this. This is really only for opponents who don't maybe have the tools to deal with the Avatar effectively. And also that don't have the ability to stop you on the flanks. So this is more of a rare case because sometimes you are going to need the Avatar to hold down a flank for you and support your other units. The Avatar is a very good anchor for your faster and more hard-hitting units to kind of revolve around. But if you don't need that, then the Avatar can indeed act as something that can take a center objective and hold it for quite a bit of time. So if your opponent leaves the center open for you and concentrates on the flanks instead to match your other units, the Avatar can take pressure off of your flanks, giving you the advantage. So again, you're using your Avatar to draw enemy forces away from the rest of your army. So from your home objective, you probably want to have the Avatar of Khaine towing your home objective in the first turn. You're going to move up and advance, just like we did on the left-hand flank with the 7-inch advance, onto the very back of the center objective. You want to be back there because this certain terrain layout requires that, enemies that want angles on you are going to have to be almost parallel to the gaps. And if you're on the very back of the objective, it's going to limit the amount of units that can actually shoot the Avatar of Khaine on turn 1. Now, of course, this is going to change as your opponent's army moves up. But like I said, if your opponent is concentrated on the flanks of the battlefield, they're probably not going to be in the best position to do that unless they're an extremely fast army. And typically, if you're going against that kind of extremely fast army, you're not going to want to deploy in the center. You're going to want to deploy on the flank, so that's really not relevant here. Now, once you move the Avatar into position, this gives you some decent line of sight protection and messes with your opponent's plans to stop your flanking forces. Now your opponent either has to ignore the Avatar and allow your Avatar to just score primary objectives turn after turn after turn, which, even if the Avatar doesn't shoot or fight a single time, is a big win for you, or they have to divert a lot of forces, and that could give you a huge advantage. And, of course, Eldar units are very pinpoint precise, and they will be able to tear your opponent's units apart. But again, just remember, if your opponent does move in something big, like a giant unit of Primaris, Sword Brethren or Terminators or, any of those kind of scary units that you're seeing a lot of in the meta right now, your Avatar will lose that fight, and it's best to, divert your attention elsewhere. The Avatar of Khaine is powerful, but when you're facing off against a good opponent that's going to have those hard-hitting elements to their army, your Avatar is not going to be able to win every single fight. All right, so what role does the Avatar of Khaine play in an Eldar army, and how do you make the most use out of it? So the Avatar is a mid-board bruiser that can destroy the toughest targets on the battlefield and take a punch in return. It's best used to draw enemies out to a side objective out in the open to be swiftly destroyed by your swifter and harder hitting elements like your Shadow Specters and your jet bikes and stuff like that. And while you can use them to hold the mid objective, it is very opponent dependent. So you do have to watch out for where your opponent's deployed and also what your opponent has brought to the table. And lastly, do watch out for heavy hitters because they do exist out there and they're more plentiful than ever. And as a matter of fact, I actually saw a really good example of what happens when you misposition your Avatar and you underestimate what your opponent has to throw at them. I saw this at the Ides of March tournament. It was streamed by Tactical Tortoise, and there was an Aeldari player, of course, pretty good Aeldari player. He made it to pretty far in the tournament, and he was going up against a Black Templar player. And a simple miscalculation by the Aeldari player led to the Avatar of Khaine being one-rounded by Grimaldus and his Primaris Sword Brethren. So guys, it is very easy to, overestimate the Avatar's durability, even for experienced Eldar players. So, don't make that mistake. Make sure that you know your opponent's threat ranges and make sure that you know what your opponent can throw at you. Alright, so in conclusion, the Avatar of Khaine is an extremely powerful force to behold on the battlefield, but like all Eldar units, must be used with precision and care to be effective, especially when it comes to positioning. It remains one of our best primary objective units in a number of matchups, however, so it's definitely really strong. I'm not saying it's weak at all. It's actually one of the best units in the Index, in my humble opinion. But you do need to use the Avatar with an extreme amount of awareness. And I think in general, that's how Eldar play anyway. You do need to play with a lot of awareness and a lot of care and positioning. And of course, the Avatar of Khaine is no exception. All right, everybody, that is going to be it for today's video. Thank you so much for watching. And also, thank you so much to all my patrons and supporters who have supported me over the last year, create content for the Eldar community. If you do want to join the channel's Patreon, I have free trials activated, which will grant you permanent access to our Discord community, which is a community of Eldar players and enthusiasts who love talking about strategy, tactics, and of course, hobbying. And I will leave the link for that in the description below. I'm also an Amazon affiliate and have a channel store page, so if you want to grab some Eldar-inspired apparel on my channel store page or some discounted Eldar miniatures on Amazon, I will leave those links in the description as well. And lastly, for all of those who are interested in joining the Eldar community painting project that I'm going to be posting a video on in early April, just a reminder that the cutoff for that is March 28th. Which is coming up in a couple weeks. Now, I know that some of you out there have not had time to fully complete their projects that they wanted to submit. I can probably extend it for a few days until March 30th, but then I really do have to just start putting it all together. So if you do have something that you're working on, definitely try to finish it up soon. But don't worry, guys, we are going to have another one probably in the beginning of the summer in a couple months as well. So, if you miss this one, you can always be a part of the next one. All right, everybody, that is going to be it for today's video. Thanks once again for watching, and I will see you guys next time. Have a good one, everybody. Peace out.